In 1645, Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie was 25 years old, and he was arguably the most powerful man in Sweden who was not the queen. He was tall, elegantly dressed in the French style, fluent in several languages, and in possession of estates so vast that their administration required its own bureaucracy. He had a private theatre at his country house at Laco Castle on Lake Vänern, the largest lake in Scandinavia, where he staged performances for guests who came from across Northern Europe. He owned properties across Sweden, Finland, and the newly acquired Baltic provinces. His annual income exceeded that of the Swedish crown in some years. He was also entirely a product of war. His father, Jacob de la Gardie, was a Franco-Flemish mercenary who had sold his military skills to Sweden at the turn of the 17th century and risen through sheer military competence to become a field marshal. In 1611, Jacob captured Novgorod from Russia during the time of Troubles, a moment of Russian internal collapse that Sweden exploited with characteristic opportunism. The Treaty of Stolbovo in 1617, which locked Russia out of the Baltic coast for 85 years, was partially Jacob's achievement. His reward was estates in Finland and Sweden, a title, and the social position that allowed his son, Magnus Gabriel, to become Queen Christina's favourite and Sweden's most ostentatious aristocrat. The de la Gardie story was representative of how the Swedish imperial nobility was built. Rapidly, deliberately, and through the systematic conversion of military service into hereditary land and title. Before Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish nobility was a relatively modest class. In 1599, there were roughly 50 noble families in Sweden. By 1650, there were over 600 introduced noble families registered at the House of Nobility. The Riddarhuset, whose Baroque palace in Stockholm's Old Town, was commissioned by Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna in 1641 precisely to give this mushrooming aristocracy an institutional home. The number of nobles had multiplied more than tenfold in 50 years. This expansion was a deliberate royal policy. Gustavus Adolphus and his successors needed officers, administrators, and governors for a rapidly growing empire. The fastest way to recruit a capable man and bind him permanently to the imperial project was to ennoble him and give him land in the territories he helped conquer. A German officer who distinguished himself at Breitenfeld might receive a Swedish title and an estate in Pomerania. A Swedish administrator sent to govern Livonia might return home after years of service with a barony and a manor in Västergötland. Noble landholdings, which had represented roughly 16% of Swedish territory in 1600, climbed to over 60% by the 1680s. One of the most dramatic concentrations of noble land ownership in European history, achieved in less than a century. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for your support, and now, let's continue. Axel Oxenstierna was the central figure of this era, not a warrior, but the administrative genius without whom the empire might never have survived the death of Gustavus Adolphus. Born in 1583 into an old Swedish noble family, Oxenstierna became chancellor in 1612 and held that office for 42 years, through the reigns of 3 monarchs, managing regencies, financing wars, negotiating treaties, and building the institutional framework of the Swedish state. He drafted the Instrument of Government of 1634, which systematized the administration of the empire and guaranteed that the highest government positions would be filled exclusively by the nobility. This was not incidental. It was designed, by securing the nobility's monopoly on senior offices, the 5 great officers of state, the governors of provinces, the commanders of major fortresses. Oxenstierna built a system in which noble families had every incentive to support imperial expansion, because expansion directly translated into more officers, more land, and more revenue for them. The Oxenstierna family itself accumulated one of the largest private fortunes in Swedish history. Estates in multiple provinces, a palace in Stockholm. The political influence to function during the minority of Queen Christina from 1632 to 1644 as the effective ruler of a European great power. The physical world these families inhabited was built to communicate power at a glance. In Stockholm, noble palaces began appearing in the 1640s and 1650s, constructed in the new Baroque style that Swedish architects imported from the Netherlands and Italy. These were not modest townhouses. They were urban statements. Large buildings with formal facades, interior courtyards, and ground floors designed to receive visitors in formal spaces that made the owner's importance immediately legible. Outside the capital, the great country estates of the imperial aristocracy were built on a scale that Sweden had never seen before. Skokloster Castle, north of Stockholm, was commissioned by Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Wrangel beginning in 1654 and remained under construction for decades. Its interior was designed to display the war trophies Wrangel had accumulated during campaigns across Germany and Poland. Weapons, armor, silver plate, paintings, and books seized from conquered territories or purchased with campaign profits. The library at Skokloster contained thousands of volumes assembled from across Europe. The Great Hall was designed for formal dining with dozens of guests, its walls hung with paintings by Dutch and German masters. Wrangel's wealth came directly from 30 years of warfare. As field marshal, he commanded Swedish armies through campaigns that moved across half a continent, and the compensation system of the period allowed senior commanders to extract wealth from the territories they operated in. Contributions imposed on German cities, seizures of abandoned estates, the systematic extraction of movable wealth from surrendered fortresses. All of these flowed upward through the command hierarchy. A successful field marshal emerged from a decade of campaigning with enough money to build a palace. The women of these households occupied a position that combined genuine authority with formal invisibility in public records. The management of large estates, including the supervision of tenant farmers, the oversight of agricultural production, the direction of domestic staff numbering in the dozens, and the management of household finances, was the work of the mistress of the house. When her husband was away on campaign or at court, and military men of the imperial era spent years at a time away from home, she was the functional head of a complex economic enterprise. Correspondence from the period shows noble wives negotiating with merchants, instructing estate managers, and making decisions about crop rotation and building maintenance with a practical competence that reflects years of direct experience. The consumption of luxury goods among the imperial nobility reached levels that had no precedent in Swedish history. French wine and Rhenish wine appeared on noble tables. Dutch paintings covered the walls of manor houses. French and Italian furniture occupied rooms that had previously held nothing more elaborate than carved Swedish wood. Silk and velvet clothing, imported silver tableware, oriental carpets, all of these moved through Stockholm's ports on ships that returned from delivering Swedish copper and iron to the markets of Amsterdam and London. This consumption was not merely personal indulgence, it was political communication. A noble who entertained lavishly and maintained a household that visibly displayed the wealth of the empire was demonstrating Sweden's arrival as a great European power. The Althing of Swedish imperial politics was the annual gathering of the Riksdag in Stockholm, where the four estates, nobility, clergy, burghers, and peasantry, assembled to debate legislation and taxation. But for the imperial nobility, the real arena of power was the Council of the Realm, the Riksråd, where the great families dominated the most sensitive decisions of state. The council managed foreign policy, decided on war and peace, and oversaw the administration of the empire during the long periods when the king was absent or underage. Its membership was drawn exclusively from the noble elite. It was, in practice, an oligarchy of the 20 or 30 most powerful families in Sweden, managing an empire on behalf of a monarchy that depended on their cooperation. The reckoning came in the 1680s. Charles V looked at the financial structure of the empire and concluded that it was insolvent. The crown had been granting away land and toll revenues faster than wars could replace them. The nobility had accumulated 60% of Swedish territory from which the crown received no tax revenue because noble estates were exempt. The Great Reduction, the Reduktionen, began in 1680. Over the following decade, the crown reclaimed estates that had been granted to the nobility since 1632. The Delagardi family lost most of its estates. Magnus Gabriel, who had spent his youth in magnificent display, spent his old age in legal disputes over land he had considered permanently his. The power of the imperial aristocracy was broken within a generation of its peak. The families survived: the Oxenstierners, the Wrangels, the Horns, the Stenbocks, but as honourable relics of an imperial age rather than as the governing class of a current empire. What they left behind was stone, canvas, and paper. The palaces built in the 1640s and 1650s still stand. Skokloster is a museum today, its interior remarkably preserved, including rooms that were never finished because construction stopped when the money stopped. The Riddarhuset still displays the 2,300 coats of arms of the families registered there during the imperial era. And in the archives of Stockholm, the correspondence of the Oxenstierna family, running to tens of thousands of letters, remains one of the richest documentary sources for understanding how a small northern country briefly held the balance of power in Europe. The Althing itself, the annual assembly at Thingvellir in Iceland, has no direct equivalent in the Swedish imperial system, but the Riksdag that met in Stockholm served a comparable function as a gathering point for the empire's elite. Every session brought together representatives from Sweden, Finland, and sometimes the Baltic provinces, creating a physical convergence of the empire's governing class that reinforced social hierarchies, settled disputes, and renewed the personal alliances on which imperial administration depended. The nobles who arrived at Stockholm for a Riksdag session were making a journey that cost weeks and significant money. They arrived with retinues appropriate to their status. They stayed in their Stockholm palaces or in rented accommodations that reflected their standing. They attended court, presented petitions, and negotiated the private arrangements that formal legislation could not cover. The financial architecture of the imperial nobility was built around three distinct income streams that only the wealthiest families managed to control simultaneously. The first was agricultural rent from Swedish and Finnish estates, a relatively stable income that depended on weather, tenant reliability, and the competence of the estate manager rather than on royal favour. The second was income from crown offices, the governorships, military commands, and judicial positions that the Oxenstierna reforms had reserved for the nobility, carrying salaries, perquisites, and the opportunity for the kind of informal income that any position of regulatory authority generates in any era. The third was war profit, the most volatile and potentially the largest stream, dependent on the continuation of successful military campaigns and the willingness of conquered territories to yield extractable wealth. When all three streams flowed simultaneously, as they did for the most successful imperial families of the mid-17th century, the resulting wealth was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of a country of 1.5 million people. When Charles V's reduction cut off the agricultural stream by reclaiming the granted estates, and when the end of successful military expansion eliminated the war profit stream, families that had maintained their positions through careful office holding found themselves relatively secure. Families that had spent their accumulated wealth on display, on the palaces, the paintings, the libraries, the theatrical performances, found themselves exposed. Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie died in 1686, 3 years after the Reduktionen had stripped most of his estates. The theatre at Laco Castle was silent. The paintings had been inventoried for transfer. The man who had been, for a decade, the most conspicuously wealthy aristocrat in Sweden ended his life in circumstances that would have been unimaginable to the young man who had staged operas for the Queen in the 1640s. His story is, in miniature, the story of the Swedish imperial nobility itself. Extraordinary in its ascent, rapid in its construction, and entirely dependent on a political and military system that could not sustain itself indefinitely.